Every torture museum in Europe has one. A wooden pyramid on legs, ropes dangling from a crossbeam, and a placard telling you that medieval inquisitors lowered screaming heretics onto the point until they confessed or died. The problem is that none of it checks out. There is no trial record, no named victim, no court document, and no surviving original device anywhere on Earth. The Judas Cradle might be the most famous torture instrument that never existed. Let that land for a second. Millions of people have stood in front of glass cases in Prague, Amsterdam, San Gimignano, and a chain of museums stretching from Tuscany to Hollywood and Mexico City, staring at a thing that was almost certainly built in the 19th century or later, by people who wanted your money more than they wanted your education. The Iron Maiden has already been debunked, the Pair of Anguish has been debunked, the Chastity Belt debunked, and the Judas Cradle sits in exactly the same evidentiary category, propped up by the same historical fog, sold to tourists by the same industry. So where did it come from? How does a device with zero primary documentation end up in every list of history's worst punishments? And if it is not real, what was real, and how do we know the difference? The answer involves a 15th century law professor who thought he was being merciful, a naming convention that reveals more than anyone noticed, a Victorian entertainment industry that is still making money, and the uncomfortable fact that the real history of torture is bad enough without the fiction. The real devices, the ones that are actually in the court records, are terrible. The fake ones are just more photogenic. To understand the Judas Cradle, you need to go to Bologna in the late 15th century, to a university lecture hall where a man named Ippolito Marsili was about to do something no one had done before. Marsili was born in 1451, earned his doctorate in 1480, and by 1482 was teaching at the University of Bologna as the first professor ever contracted to teach criminal law there. This was not a side appointment. Bologna was one of the intellectual centres of the Italian peninsula, and Marsili was building something genuinely new, a systematic legal architecture for how and when a state could inflict pain on a person to extract information. He was not a sadist writing a wish list. He was a jurist trying to bring order to a process that, in his time, had very little. He published his major work, the Tractatus de Questionibus, in 1524. The Library of Congress holds editions from 1529, 1551, and 1583. It is a real book, a real legal treatise, and you can look it up. Inside, Marsili catalogued roughly 40 torture methods in use across Italian courts. His stated goal was not to celebrate them or to expand the repertoire. He wanted to regulate them. He argued that torture was a tool requiring careful moderation by judges, and that the worst methods, the ones that shattered bones and seared flesh, should be replaced with approaches that caused suffering without permanent physical destruction. One of those approaches was forced vigil. The concept was simple and horrible in its own quiet way. You make a person sit on a pointed stool, muscles locked and burning, unable to relax or shift their weight, until their body physically cannot fall asleep. Marsili documented sessions lasting up to 40 hours. 40 hours without sleep, balanced on a point, every muscle in the lower body cramping and screaming. He considered this more humane than breaking someone on the wheel. Think about what that means in practical terms. After about 16 hours without sleep, cognitive function starts to deteriorate. After 24 hours, the brain enters microsleep episodes whether the person wants to sleep or not. By 36 hours, disorientation, paranoia, and hallucinations are common. Marsili's 40-hour sessions would have pushed a person into a state where they could barely distinguish reality from delirium, all while balancing on a pointed surface that made every microsecond of lost consciousness a jolt of fresh pain. The body wants to collapse, the seat will not let it. That tension between exhaustion and agony is what breaks people. He is also credited with documenting water torture, the technique later misnamed Chinese water torture. So the man most closely associated with the Judas Cradle's origin was, by his own lights, a reformer. He was trying to make the process of state-sanctioned pain less destructive. The fact that his reforms included forcing people to balance on pointed stools for nearly 2 days tells you everything you need to know about the baseline he was working from. When your idea of progress is replacing the wheel and the brand with sleep deprivation, the starting point was very dark. The French had a name for the device Marsili described. La Veille, meaning the wake or the vigil. Not a pyramid of impalement, Not a machine of slow penetration, but a sleep deprivation tool, and that name is one of the most telling details in this entire story, because it reveals what the thing was originally designed to do. It was not designed to kill or to maim, it was designed to exhaust. The physical description from French sources about pre-revolutionary torture practices is more precise than anything you will find on a museum placard. A wooden stool, approximately 4 feet high, with the seat carved into a 6-sided diamond shape. The base of the spine and the coccyx supported the entire body weight on this narrow ridge. Anyone who has sat on a hard surface for 2 hours knows the misery that begins after 20 minutes, the shifting, the aching, the desperate search for a comfortable angle that does not exist. Now, multiply that by 40, add a carved point, and remove the option of standing up or lying down. The Italian name was Veille, carrying the same meaning of forced wakefulness. The linguistic evidence from both French and Italian sources points to the same function. This was a tool for preventing sleep, not for impalement. The name Judas Cradle, with its biblical reference to Judas Iscariot and the symbolism of betrayal and treachery, came later. The German equivalent is Judas Weege, the Italian Culla di Giuda. All the Judas names reference punishment for betrayal. The original names, La Veille and Veille, reference the vigil, the wake. Somewhere between Marsili and the modern museum, the function shifted in popular imagination from sleep deprivation to something far more graphic. Here is where the story fractures into 2 timelines. In one, you have Marsili's documented device, a pointed stool used for extended forced wakefulness in Italian courts, with at least some basis in the legal and medical literature of the period. In the other, you have the version that sells tickets, a tall pyramid with a sharp apex, ropes and pulleys, naked victims suspended and slowly lowered, weights attached to ankles, sessions lasting days, and systematic use by the Inquisition. The first version has a paper trail, thin but real. The second has none. The gap between those 2 versions is where the interesting question lives. How does a sleep deprivation stool become a machine of impalement? The answer probably involves several centuries of incremental exaggeration, each retelling adding a detail the previous one lacked. The stool gets taller and the point gets sharper. Someone adds ropes, someone else adds pulleys. The victim goes from sitting to being suspended. The function shifts from preventing sleep to causing penetrating trauma. By the time the device reaches the 19th century showman, it bears about as much resemblance to Marsili's Veille as a Hollywood vampire bears to the folklore of rural Wallachia. The transformation happened over centuries, driven by forces that had nothing to do with historical accuracy. 2 variations appear in museum collections today: a small pyramid fixed to 4 angled legs, stool-like, and a pyramid sitting atop a single spike or pole, a more extreme version with no clear provenance. Every element of the more extreme version, the ropes, the pulleys, the stripping of the victim, the weights on the ankles, exists only in descriptions that postdate the device's supposed period of use. Nobody writing at the time Marsili was alive described anything like the full apparatus that modern museums display. The audience for the story stopped being legal scholars and became paying customers, and paying customers wanted blood. That audience was not medieval, it was Victorian. Medievalists and historians have spent the last few decades pulling apart the popular image of the Middle Ages as a uniquely savage era. And what they have found is embarrassing for the torture museum industry. The Iron Maiden is the most thoroughly debunked example. Johann Philipp Siebenkees, a German writer who lived from 1759 to 1796, fabricated a detailed history claiming the Iron Maiden was first used in Nuremberg on August 14, 1515. The date is specific and the story is convincing, which makes it all the more damaging that it is entirely invented. No mention of the Iron Maiden exists anywhere before the 19th century. Professor Wolfgang Schild of the University of Bielefeld, a criminal law scholar, examined surviving Iron Maidens in museum collections and demonstrated that they were pieced together from unrelated metal artifacts. Separate parts, different periods, bolted together to create something spectacular for exhibition. They were not discovered in castle dungeons, they were assembled in workshops. The Pair of Anguish follows the same trajectory. Surviving examples contain coiled springs, a technology from the early modern period, not the Middle Ages. No contemporary first-hand accounts describe its use on a living person, and the surviving specimens appear mechanically too weak to have functioned as described. They look menacing behind glass. They would not actually do what the placards claim. A historian with a master's degree from Brandeis, writing under the name Tales of Times Forgotten, traced the origins of most famous torture devices and found that the majority were invented by hoaxers and con artists in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The business model was elegant in its cynicism: build something that looks old and painful, attach a story about medieval barbarity, display it in a room with dim lighting and ominous music, and charge admission. That business model has never stopped working. It just moved online and into more cities. There is something almost admirable about the longevity of the con. A Victorian showman builds a device in the 1880s, calls it medieval, and puts it behind glass. 140 years later, his creation is still earning money, and the story he invented is the one that shows up when you search the internet. Every YouTube video, every listicle, every history podcast that describes the Judas Cradle as a documented Inquisition device is repeating the marketing copy of a 19th century carnival barker. The original fabricator is long dead, but his business is doing better than ever. Rick Steves, the travel writer, has publicly called most European torture museums tourist traps that appeal to the lowest desires of dumbed-down travellers. He suspects there is a gory gear catalogue distributing Iron Maidens and equipment to these museums, because nearly every major European city now has one. Amsterdam's torture museum has been described as tacky torture exhibits, with plenty of papier-mâché gore and absolutely nothing historic. A chain of torture museums across Tuscany, in San Gimignano, Siena, Montepulciano, and Volterra claims to use only authentic artefacts, a claim that has drawn skepticism. The industry has spread to Hollywood and Mexico City. The profit motive has not changed since the Victorian era, only the gift shops have improved. There is also a device called the Iron Chair, sometimes called the Witch's Chair, sometimes confusingly called the Judas Chair, adding another layer of naming fog to an already murky story. Museum descriptions claim it was covered in 500 to 1500 spikes, with a hole under the seat for hot coals. It has the same authenticity problems as everything else in these collections. Most museum examples are reconstructions. The Iron Chair, the Judas Cradle, the Iron Maiden, the Pair of Anguish, they all sit in the same glass cases in the same dimly lit rooms, with the same confidently written placards, and they all share the same relationship to verifiable history, which is almost none. The Judas Cradle sits comfortably in this ecosystem. No authenticated surviving example exists. Museum pieces in Prague, Amsterdam, and elsewhere are acknowledged reconstructions and replicas, not verified period artifacts. No primary source document from the medieval or early modern period describes the device in the extreme form that tourism markets, and no Inquisition trial record mentions it by name. That last point is where the popular story collapses entirely, because the Judas Cradle is almost always associated with the Spanish Inquisition in the public imagination. Juan Chulilla, who holds a PhD and has written on this subject directly, states that the Judas Cradle was not an Inquisition torture method. Period. The Spanish Inquisition had exactly 3 approved methods: the garrucha, which was strapado, hanging the accused by the wrists with their arms tied behind the back; the toca, water torture, pouring water over cloth covering the face; and the potro, the rack. That was the complete, exhaustive list, and nothing else was authorised. And there is a reason the list was short. On May 15th, 1252, Pope Innocent IV issued a papal bull called Ad Extirpanda, prompted by the murder of the papal inquisitor of Lombardy. It authorised the torture of heretics as thieves and bandits, but mandated stopping short of danger to life or limb. Pope Alexander IV reaffirmed it in 1259. Pope Clement IV reaffirmed it in 1265. The official rules prohibited methods that resulted in bloodshed, miscarriage, mutilation, or death. Torture could be applied only once per accused person. By the standards of the time, and this is genuinely uncomfortable to acknowledge but historically accurate, the Inquisition operated under tighter restrictions than secular courts of the same period. Of course, rules invite workarounds, and the Inquisition developed loopholes with the same care it applied to everything else. The first was the Continuatio Doctrine, and it is a masterpiece of legal bad faith. The rule said torture could not be repeated, so inquisitors reclassified repeat sessions as continuations of the original session. The Latin phrase was non ad modum iterationis sed continuationis. Not by way of repetition, but of continuation. Inquisitor Nicholas Eimerick defended the practice in writing, Torments should not be repeated, but since they are not prohibited from being continued, and whenever new evidence arises, a new session begins. A prisoner tortured on Monday, returned to a cell, and tortured again on Wednesday was not being tortured twice. He was being tortured once in 2 parts, separated by a brief intermission. Different day, same legal fiction. The rules survived intact while meaning nothing. The second workaround was the blood prohibition. The rack, strappado, and water torture did not draw blood externally. The damage they inflicted was internal: dislocated shoulders, torn ligaments, organ compression, ruptured muscles, all of it technically bloodless. The letter of the law held while the body broke. The Inquisition also maintained a formalised system of psychological pressure that complicates the cartoon version of inquisitors as mindless brutes swinging hot irons. The process had 3 escalating stages, each with a formal Latin name that suggests how seriously the institution took its own bureaucratic procedures. Territio verbalis was the verbal threat, delivered in the judgment hall. The inquisitor described in detail what was going to happen. Territio realia was the physical threat. The prisoner was walked to the torture chamber, shown the actual instruments, and forced to watch them being prepared, oiled, tested, adjusted. The prisoner smelled the room, heard the metal, saw what was coming. Then came la presentation de la question. The torture sentence was formally pronounced. The prisoner was taken to the chamber again, and then they were returned to their cell without being touched. Not out of mercy, but because the psychological technique often produced a confession without the expense and complication of the real thing. Galileo Galilei experienced territio realis in 1633. He was brought before the instruments and threatened. The Pope decreed the interrogation should stop at the threat, citing Galileo's advanced age. He was never physically tortured. The system had stages, and it did not always reach the last one. Multiple sources indicate that actual physical torture was used less frequently in Inquisition proceedings than the popular version of the story would suggest. The threat was often enough. Think about what the Inquisition actually looked like from the inside, which is very different from the dungeon fantasy. It was a bureaucracy built on paperwork, formal proceedings conducted in Latin, stages of escalation with official names, and legal doctrines governing when and how pain could be applied. Every session was documented. It was horrifying, absolutely, but it was horrifying in the way that any system designed to break people through institutional process is horrifying. It was methodical, not chaotic, and methodical institutions keep records. The Garucha, the Toca, and the Potro are all in those records. The Judas Cradle is not. None of this is a defense of the Inquisition. It was a machinery of religious persecution that destroyed lives and families across centuries on multiple continents. The point is narrower and more specific. The institution that supposedly used the Judas Cradle had a documented, regulated, and extensively recorded system of coercion, and the Judas Cradle does not appear anywhere in that system. The devices that do appear in the records, the Garucha, the Toca, and the Potro, are terrible enough without adding fictional ones to the roster. Strappado alone, which involved hoisting someone by their wrists bound behind the back until the shoulders dislocated, appears in actual court documents, in Inquisition trial records, in legal manuals, and in multiple eyewitness reports. That is what documented Inquisition torture looked like. Ugly, simple, and on paper. The difference between a documented device and an undocumented one becomes painfully clear when you compare the Judas Cradle's empty evidence file with one that actually has a record. The wooden horse, also called the Spanish donkey, was a triangular prism shaped like a sawhorse, with a sharp upper edge. Not a pyramid point. The victim straddled the edge, and their own weight provided the agony. Unlike the Judas Cradle, this device has a paper trail that stretches back centuries and includes specific names, specific dates, and specific courts. Jesuits in modern-day Canada used the wooden horse as early as February 1646. A soldier in Salem, Massachusetts was sentenced to ride it in 1661. Richard Gibson in Maine received the punishment in 1670. George Washington ordered a soldier named William Patin to ride the wooden horse for 15 minutes on July 10, 1775. The offence was threatening and abusing persons. Paul Revere approved a court-martial sentence for a soldier named Thomas Cleverley to ride it for 15 minutes with a musket strapped to each foot in September 1776. The crime was playing cards on the Sabbath. 15 minutes on a blade with iron weights hanging from your ankles because you played cards on a Sunday. The punishment was considered so routine that the sentencing officer, one of the most famous men in American history, did not find it worth commenting on beyond the bare notation. Revere handed down the same sentence to another soldier, Caleb Southwood, for the same crime in the same month. The wooden horse is one of those devices where the simplicity is the horror. There is no mechanism to describe, no elaborate engineering to marvel at. It is a sharp edge and gravity. The longer you sit, the worse it gets. 15 minutes with added weight would have been excruciating. Extended sentences would have caused tissue damage, nerve compression, and in extreme cases, permanent injury to the groin and perineum. The device at Camp Douglas near Chicago during the Civil War, a version called Morgan's Mule, stood 16 feet tall and 30 feet long. That was not a punishment stool. That was an installation designed to process people in volume. Reverend John Pittman kept an order book documenting wooden horse sentences. Harper's Weekly published an engraving of the device in use at Petersburg, Virginia, on November 26, 1864. The US Army did not abolish the practice until flogging was banned in 1861. That is what a real historical torture device looks like in the documentary record. Names and dates, court-martial proceedings, published engravings in national magazines, order books maintained by military chaplains, and sentences approved and signed by men whose faces ended up on currency. The Judas Cradle has none of that. Not one named victim in any surviving record, not one court document, not one contemporary illustration from its supposed period of use. The absence of evidence, in this case, is not a gap in the research, it is the finding. Despite being called one of the most famous torture devices in history, the Judas Cradle exists in a documentation vacuum that no amount of museum placards can fill. Every other entry in the standard list of historical torture methods, the ones that were actually used, left marks in the legal and bureaucratic record. They appear in trial transcripts, sentencing documents, military orders, diplomatic correspondence, and eyewitness testimony. The Judas Cradle appears in none of these. It appears only in the stories people tell about the past, which is a very different kind of evidence. If the device did exist in any form, and someone survived the acute trauma, the thing that would have killed them was invisible to everyone involved. The pyramid tip was never washed between victims. Bodily fluids, tissue and blood remained on the surface for the next person. In a world that understood nothing about bacterial transmission, this meant that every session introduced pathogens from previous victims directly into open wounds in the bloodstream. The mortality context from the pre-antibiotic world makes the implications clear without exaggeration. In the 19th century, 50% of amputation patients died of sepsis. As late as 1941, the mortality rate for Staphylococcus aureus septicemia was 82%. Ignaz Semmelweis documented that 16% of the women in his maternity ward in Vienna died of puerperal sepsis. That was in a hospital staffed by trained physicians who washed their hands in the same basin of water between patients. The timeline of infection death was its own cruelty. Direct trauma from the device could kill within hours if the injuries were severe enough. Infection operated on a different schedule entirely, days to weeks. A victim pulled off the device and returned to a cell might believe the worst was behind them. The wounds would close or at least scab over. The immediate pain would begin to recede into a dull, manageable ache. And then, 3 or 4 or 7 days later, the fever would start. A warmth that would not break. Then rigors, shaking so violent the teeth crack against each other. Delirium, swelling at the wound site, hot to the touch, spreading outward. Organ failure as the blood itself becomes toxic. Death in a stone cell from an enemy no one in that century could see or name or comprehend. The torturer did not plan this, could not have planned it. Miasma theory, the belief that disease spread through bad air rather than contact with contaminated surfaces, dominated medical thinking until well past the mid-19th century. Not cleaning the device was not a strategy, it was indifference. The same indifference that killed women in maternity wards and soldiers in field hospitals for centuries before anyone thought to wash a scalpel between patients. The connection between a dirty instrument and a dead prisoner days later would have been invisible to every person in the room. And there is a final irony that would have mattered to the torturer more than the infection. The entire purpose of judicial torture was to extract a legally admissible confession. A dead prisoner could not confess. a confession extracted from someone who died afterward lost much of its legal weight. The infection was an unintended side effect that actively undermined the tool's only purpose. The device, if it existed, was self-defeating in a way no one involved could have understood. So where does all of this leave the Judas Cradle? Somewhere in a grey zone that is actually more interesting than a clean answer in either direction. Not definitively debunked the way the Iron Maiden has been, because there is that kernel in Marsili's work, in the French Veille tradition, in the Italian Veille. A device matching the general description may have existed in some form, likely originating as a sleep deprivation stool in early modern Italy or France. The six-sided diamond seat, approximately 4 feet high, designed to prevent rest by making every position agony. That much has at least some documentary basis. The extreme version is another matter entirely. The pyramid of impalement with ropes, pulleys, and systematic Inquisition deployment is almost certainly a fabrication. Assembled over centuries by the same forces that created the Iron Maiden and the Pair of Anguish. Victorian-era showmen, anti-Catholic propagandists who wanted the Inquisition to look as barbaric as possible, and an entertainment industry that learned early that medieval horror sells tickets and clicks. The anti-Catholic angle matters here. Protestant countries had every reason to make Catholic institutions look as savage as they could. The Inquisition gave them a real villain, so inventing the props was easy. Nobody was going to fact-check the torture devices when the torture itself was documented. Once the Judas Cradle got attached to the Inquisition story, it stuck. Try telling people a thing they already believe is worse than they thought, and then try telling them you made part of it up. This is the same dynamic that produced the myth of the flat Earth belief. Almost no educated person in medieval Europe thought the Earth was flat. That idea was invented in the 19th century, largely by Washington Irving, as part of a broader project to make the Middle Ages look ignorant and backward. The Judas Cradle may owe its cultural survival to the same impulse. It makes the past look worse, and people want the past to look worse because it makes the present feel like progress. The device Marsili described was designed by a man who believed he was making the world slightly less brutal. Sleep deprivation instead of broken bones. Exhaustion instead of fire. He was the first known person to document sleep deprivation as a method of coercion, and he considered it a form of progress. 500 years later, the CIA's enhanced interrogation program used sleep deprivation extensively. Detainees were kept awake for days at a time, sometimes in stress positions, sometimes with loud music or temperature manipulation layered on top. The technique that Marsili documented in the early 1500s as a humane alternative to the rack is still in the interrogation playbook. It just stopped needing a pointed stool. The continuity is unsettling. A method that a 15th century Italian jurist considered a step toward moderation is, half a millennium later, still being used by the most powerful intelligence agencies on Earth. The popular version of medieval history gets the timeline backward. The first 700 years of the Middle Ages saw relatively little formal, systematic torture. The era people picture when they imagine dungeons and iron devices, the Inquisition, the witch trials, the public executions and elaborate punishments. That was the early modern period, the 1500s through the 1700s. The rack was not widely used in England until the very end of the 15th century and saw its heaviest use under Elizabeth I and the Tudors. Guy Fawkes was early modern, not medieval. The Salem witch trials took place in 1692. The peak of Inquisition activity was the 16th and 17th centuries. When people say they are horrified by medieval barbarism, they are usually horrified by the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Most everyday medieval justice relied on fines, public shaming through stocks and pillory and shame masks or exile. A person convicted of theft was more likely to lose a hand or stand in the pillory for a day than end up in a dungeon on a device. Prisons as a primary form of punishment are a surprisingly modern invention. The medieval world punished publicly and moved on. The elaborate, mechanized, hidden cruelty that fills the popular imagination belongs to a later age that had the engineering, the bureaucracy, and the appetite for it. The next time you walk into one of those museums and stand in front of a wooden pyramid on legs, you will know something the placard will never tell you. The Inquisition had 3 approved methods, and this was not among them. The device has no named victims, no trial records, and no verified originals. The man whose work comes closest to describing something like it was trying to make torture less destructive, not more. And the museum you're standing in is the direct descendant of a 19th century sideshow, built by the same kind of people who bolted together the Iron Maiden from spare parts and called it history.